Let me set the scene for you. It's 1950 and the inaugural Formula One World Championship kicks off at Silverstone. Everyone has come out for the event, including King George VI and several other members of the royal family. Italy's Alfa Romeo is set to dominate with the Alfetta 158, which actually debuted back in 1938 before World War II. The starting grid is filled with 21 cars, long machines with open wheels, open cockpits, and drivers sporting goggles and leather caps. The crowd would recognize names like Giuseppe Farina, soon to be the winner of the race and the first ever Formula One world champion, Juan Manuel Fangio and Luigi Fagioli. Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of the Grid Girls Formula. As we are now in a little bit of a lull for the summer break, we obviously don't have a race recap, which is very, very sad. But I thought that it would be fun to do a little bit of a different episode and talk about what F1 was like whenever it first began, especially since this is the 75th anniversary of the sport, which is very cool. So as I mentioned, the very first ever Formula One race was held at Silverstone in 1950. And the season actually consisted of 7 races. So we had Great Britain, that's Silverstone, Monaco, very historical, still have it today. Indianapolis, actually, Switzerland, Belgium, France, and Italy. A little caveat, though, about the Indianapolis 500. So yes, the Indianapolis 500 was actually part of the Formula One World Championships early on, but most teams actually didn't participate in the Indy 500, but it technically wasn't run by the FIA, but the points did still count towards the Formula One championships. So a couple of key players to mention in the inaugural year include Giuseppe, aka Nino Farina, who, as I mentioned, would be the first ever Formula One world champion, and he was quite the bold driver. He was known for driving pretty recklessly and yet somehow managing to survive numerous accidents actually while competing. He definitely had the automotive industry in his blood. His father actually had a body workshop in Turin, Italy. He raced a variety of cars over the years, crashing most of them at some point or another. But he actually managed to impress Enzo Ferrari, who recruited him for the Scuderia Ferrari Alfa Romeo team before the war, and then he picked up it again after the war during the first season of Formula One. He didn't necessarily have, how do I put this, the best vibe about him. He could be described by some of the other racers as being a bit aloof and disapproving with those of a lesser social pedigree. He was known as the gentleman of the sport, which could put him at odds sometimes with Fangio, who very much came from like a working class Argentinian background. That said, he was the first one to visit Fangio at his hospital bed during a near-fatal crash in 1952. So, you can decide what that means. Even if he had a little bit of a reputation at times, sounded like, at the end of the day, he was just a racing driver. Which brings us to talk about the absolute legend that is Juan Manuel Fangio, often considered to be one of the greatest, if not the greatest, drivers of all time. He was born in Argentina. He started working at as a mechanic at age 11 and spent nearly 40 years in that position. He wound up coming to Europe age 38 to race and had an extremely entertaining driving style. He actually had very few accidents, surprisingly enough, for that era. Which is in stark opposition to Farina. And his one serious injury that I mentioned, that near-fatal crash in 1952, it was a result of some extreme fatigue where he had been up all night and he crashed and broke his neck. He was definitely an international sensation, a big celebrity, enough so that he was actually kidnapped in Cuba by members of Fidel Castro's rebellion movement due to his fame, but they liked him so much that they just let him go unharmed. So that's pretty iconic in my opinion. He was very much respected by those who raced him, which was a bit of a stark contrast compared to a lot of the racers at the time. He was considered to be very respectable, very humble, very kind, And a lot of the racing drivers in that day didn't give off that same kind of air, even if they were good people. That wasn't really how they came across. So it was very different for him compared to a lot of the other drivers at the time. That being said, Enzo Ferrari actually wasn't the biggest fan of Fangio because he left Ferrari to go to Maserati, which was like the worst thing he could have done in Enzo Ferrari's mind, apparently. But he was very much a team player. You could often see him working on the car himself, in addition to just being a general leader on the team. He actually wound up retiring after a couple of years in the sport, and he lived a very long, happy life, passing away in 1995, age 84, at his home in Argentina, which is not something that can be said about a lot of drivers, especially in this time period. Finally, I mentioned him in passing, but we can't go through this episode without talking a little bit about Enzo Ferrari. So his team, the Ferrari team, which you guys know I'm a big Ferrari fan, so I had to do a little bit of diving into Ferrari. His team is the only team to have competed in every single season of Formula One since the championship began. Very iconic. We all know it. There are a whole wealth of stories that we could dive into about Enzo Ferrari, and maybe at some point I'll do a full episode about him and his life and how the business came to be. He had the difficult task of growing his business with the impact of World War II in Italy ongoing. And despite many difficult family matters going on, he was able to create a very iconic name for himself in the world of motorsport, in the world of just automotives in general, for both positive and negative reasons. He has multiple sides. I'm sure that if anybody else saw the Ferrari movie, you know what I can be talking about and referencing. But it is safe to say that he definitely helped to pave the world of Formula One as we know it today. And it wouldn't be the same without the Ferrari. There'd probably be a lot less arguing over the radio without the Ferraris, but then would we be entertained? Probably not. Okay, so we all know that the thing that I find one of the coolest things about Formula One is definitely the innovation and the technology. So would this be my podcast if we didn't go into some technical aspects of the difference between the cars that were driven way back in 1950 versus the cars that are driven today? No, it would not. So that is what we're going to be discussing. So let's start with the chassis and the materials that the cars are made out of. So as I talked about in an episode pretty recently, actually, Formula One cars today are made primarily out of carbon fiber. The chassis is made out of this. It's very strong and light, and it is designed to absorb energy when the car inevitably crashes. It's also really light, it's durable, and so it is able to withstand a lot of impact. It is also very customizable, so you mold it to be exactly how you want it, which is very helpful for aerodynamics and things like that. But unfortunately, so going back, safety was not a top priority in 1950. People did not show up, every single person who was in the race, to leave the race. Unfortunately, it's very sad to say. I think, in my opinion, it's tough, but it was just a fact of the sport at the time, because safety just wasn't even a priority at all. So the cars were primarily made of tubular steel space frame chassis that was hand welded, and the body panels were made of aluminum for lightness. So there are definitely some similarities between today and back when Formula One first started. They're both optimizing a strength-to-weight ratio, trying to lighten the car as much as possible. They also want to take advantage of the stiffness of the car, though the cars way back in the day were definitely a lot more difficult to drive due to manual steering, heavy clutches, and extremely stiff suspension, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. Okay. Next, let's talk about engines. I am not the expert in engines, but I always find it so interesting to read about, so I will try to do my best to explain. But today's engines by the FIA standard, at least this year. I'm pretty sure some regulations are probably changing in 2026. We all know the regulation change is coming. But for right now, all of the engines have a common formula that is set by the FIA, which consists of a 4-stroke 1.6 liter V6 engine with a single turbocharger and 2 hybrid electric systems. So the 4-stroke engine consists of 4 phases, basically, which is the intake, compression, power, and exhaust. We can go into that in a future episode if we want to really do a deep dive on engines. The V6 just means that there are 6 cylinders, 3 on each side of the engine block. The turbocharger uses exhaust gases to spin a turbine, which basically drives a compressor that forces more air into the engine, which just helps to increase the power output by allowing more fuel to be burned. So it makes it more efficient. The hybrid electric systems also help to store energy. The power output of these engines is estimated to be about 1,000 horsepower, and they are very energy efficient in comparison to how they used to be. So in the early days of Formula One, there were actually 2 types of engines that were allowed. You could have a 5.4 liter atmospheric engine or a 1.5 liter supercharged engine, which basically means that you were using a device that forces, again, more air into that engine to increase the power output. And this is the type of engine that the Alfa Romeos used back in 1950. And it produced around 350 horsepower, but as I mentioned, lacked fuel efficiency. They were averaging about 1.5 mpg as opposed to the 6 to 7 mpg that we get today. In both engines, though, they were again just trying to maximize that power while minimizing the size of the engine. It is also interesting to note actually that in 1950, the first F1 cars, they actually had the engine located at the front. It didn't move to the rear until 1955. I think Enzo Ferrari actually said something about this where he insisted that the engine should go at the front of the car because it's like the ox that drives the carriage. So it's just kind of a holdover from that, which is kind of interesting because it feels like that's like a long ago idea, but that would have been in the lifetime of these people. And that's so interesting to me. I don't know. Anyway, so the F1 engine didn't move into the rear until 1955. Okay, let's talk about suspension. If you don't know, suspension is the thing that I like the most on cars. Whenever I was on a Formula team in college, I did suspension, so always holds a very near and dear place in my heart. So the 1950 Alfetta, which was, like I said, that car driven by Farina, the suspension was probably the least advanced part of the car. It had a transverse leaf spring at the front and a swing axle at the rear that was also supported by leaf swings. So a swing axle has a universal joint on either side of the transaxle, which then connects to the drive shaft, which basically means that the rear wheels are independent of each other, which is very important when going around corners because each wheel has to go at different speeds to cover different distances. However, it does not allow for much flexibility with like the camber, for example. So we've talked about camber a little bit before, how you want to use that to help with your cornering grip and all of that kind of stuff. This suspension design anyway was actually replaced by a De Dion system the following year, which I'm not going to get into in this episode. Again, that could be something that we talk about in the future if you are interested. The wheels were extremely thin. I think they were still Pirelli tires, I want to say, way back when. But they were super duper thin with wire spokes along it, and they look very, very different today. Moving on to aerodynamics, let's just say that aero was not exactly on anybody's mind in 1950. Today's cars are absolutely designed to maximize cornering speeds with downforce, but in 1950, the focus was all on straight line speed. So that smooth, almost like cigar or like sausage shape helped to minimize the drag, but the cornering grip was just really not a priority, and they were a lot more concerned about just making sure all of the parts were effectively cooled, and that was kind of how they used the air rather than using the air to increase their downforce or their cornering or anything like that. It really just wasn't even something that had come up yet. The brakes in 1950 were aluminum drum brakes, which would actually struggle a lot in wet weather, but now we use carbon disc brakes at the front of cars, and then the rear brakes are a lot more advanced. friction from brakes, engine braking, and electrical braking all combine and are deployed in the brakes. So our brakes, they have I think I was reading somewhere it said like 5G of stopping force and can withstand temperatures up to 1,000 degrees, which is very crazy. And I suspect that the people in 1950 would be very mind blown by all of those facts. Now let's talk a bit about the rules, especially with the rule change coming up next year. It's so interesting just to see how rules change over time. They're going to be extremely different back in 1950 compared to today. But some significant ones to point out is one that I already mentioned, that there were actually 2 engine options as opposed to just one singular option, which is the case today. There was also no weight minimum. You just wanted to make those cars as light as possible. There were also no fuel restrictions, and as I already kind of alluded, there were hardly any safety standards put in place. Actually, crazy. I was reading this, and seatbelts actually were not mandatory early on in Formula One. I'm like, oh my gosh, you guys, what do you mean seatbelts weren't required? That is absolutely mind-boggling to me. But it just goes to show just how different the times were back then. Today we have very, very strict engine formula of what they are allowed to follow. We have a weight minimum. It's 798 kilograms. There's a lot of fuel limits and requirements on sustainable fuel blends, and also much, 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 much more emphasis on keeping the drivers safe. All of the teams are required to go through crash tests, have cockpit survival cells, halo devices, and we do now actually require seatbelts. Actually, granted, are they really considered seatbelts? They're more like harnesses, honestly, that they're in nowadays. So I think that was for the best. So as I mentioned, we obviously have a lot of rule regulation changes taking place next year, which I just think is just so interesting and just forces everybody to have this period of such rapid development and rapid change and innovation. You want to be pushing those rules as far as you can. And I always see these things about people being like, oh, like these people cheated or whatever, because like once they do it, there's a rule then made about it. And in my opinion, that is like the cherry on top of like, okay, if you are able to do something that then Formula One needs to create a rule for, you know that you have done something so innovative that has pushed the boundaries so far that they are going to change the rules around it. I feel like the rules in Formula One are meant to be broken. Like, you in motorsport are meant to push those rules as far to their limits as you possibly can, because it's just at that very end of the spectrum that you're able to maximize the design and the innovation and the speed probably and performance of your car. And it's just a pool of innovation, and I think you can really see that in the comparison between this 1950 car versus the car that we have today. And it's just exciting to think that we're about to see another period of change and to be able to find out what that's going to entail. The spirit of the 1950s definitely lives on in the drivers and the tracks today, pushing those limits of performance, efficiency, and of course, human skill. And I hope that you guys enjoyed today's episode, learned something new. I know it's a little bit on the shorter side, but I had such a fun time like researching this and learning a little bit more about the early days of Formula One and how it compares to today, both in terms of just technicalities and also just in the spirit of the sport. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at Good Girls Formula, like, subscribe, all of those kinds of things. Leave any comments below about topics that you want me to cover in future episodes, and I will talk to you guys later. Bye!